Just a quick comment on the regulation process. In the management right bands, the protection of, or the right to have no harmful interference is measured in terms of a maximum permitted interfering signal. And that's defined in terms of a signal strength at the receiver. There's a power floor under the management right which is relevant for the concept Mansour introduced of underlay, I think the expression is, where if your power spectral density of your transmitter is low enough, measured in watts per hertz or per megahertz, whatever, as an EIRP, that is the radiated power, that's the unit which you can use to operate below the management right. So if you buy a management right, you only own it down as far as this power floor in terms of the right to transmit. So another transmitter can operate at lower power spectral density below you. But really, you have a reasonable expectation to have your receive protection location respected as one factor. So just because somebody's below the power floor doesn't mean that if they're operating there, they won't cause you interference. They can be near your receiver and then exceed the recognised maximum MPIS, maximum protected interfering signal level, because they're measured in different units. And also, in order to create a license for something, whether it's a general user license or an individual license for a cognitive radio, for example, it's still also, to be certified, needs to be technically compatible with other receivers. So the protocols and mechanisms for protecting these receivers need to be sophisticated enough that they will guarantee the reception, the freedom from interference of the receivers. So under the present regime, that would need to be respected at the engineering and licensing level. On the other hand, if you allowed cognitive radios without license simply because they're below the legislation, one would need to think then perhaps about different legislation, changes to it, in order to manage cognitive radio in a band which is also a management right. So there's some quick thoughts.
Thanks, Ian. Just to add to that, I think in my presentation I mentioned about the ultra-wideband communication devices, the GUL, that's actually created underneath the existing management rights power flows. So there's an existing scheme that is already operating as an underlay technology.
Just to add to what Ian was saying, I think that what has not been really stated today is that regardless of how you build a cognitive system, that system is going to have to continuously sense the spectrum and determine that they are below the noise floor or that the primary user is not there. And that's going to add considerably to the cost of a cognitive radio terminal, because he's going to have a receiver that's continually scanning his available spectrum. And if he senses a primary user, he's got to go somewhere else. And even if he is transmitting and he can't hear a primary user, he's going to have to keep his power flux density below some threshold, as Ian has mentioned. So there's a lot of requirements going to be on a cognitive radio before it can really be an operational, quote, licensed system.
Yeah, thanks, Des. Just my comment on that would be, those are implementation details which we'll have sorted out in a few months, I hope. But I'd just like to remind people, I don't know whether you're all familiar with some of the history of cognitive radio. It was about 2002, the FCC, and I think Bruce Fett was actually the author, but there was a white paper put out called Unlicensed and Unshackled, and it was a review of the introduction of unlicensed spectrum services into the US. And the conclusion of that white paper was that there was more benefit in terms of economic benefit in dollars per hertz from the introduction of unlicensed spectrum services, specifically Wi-Fi 2.4 and also 5.8 gigahertz, than there was from any other spectrum allocation in the US. So the answer is, I think, goes back to Brian's comment, that the economic benefits from introducing license-free or very low license regime services such as Wi-Fi and cognitive radio, the economic benefits could far outweigh any potential revenue to the government through spectrum licensing. And I'd like to declare now to to Mansour, I have no affiliation with any telecommunications carrier here, so I'm not pushing the telecommunications carrier perspective, and you might guess from my comments. I think my other comment is that as a user of telecommunications services, the lower we can push the prices of telecommunication services through the introduction of advanced technologies that mean we don't have to pay the overhead of spectrum licenses, that would be fantastic.
Any comment to Mansour from your end?
Do you want to make a comment first, Mansour?
Thank you, Murray. I have no comment in this debate.
I think it's very important to think about it in the light of what I mentioned earlier on today as well. That, fundamentally, the costs of wireless systems have to come down dramatically, and spectrum's a major part of that cost, and in the past has been an enormous part of that cost. And so we are going to have to get the cost down somehow or other, and whatever technologies are available to make that happen are going to be absolutely essential in the 2015 to 2020 timeframe. There's no debate about that.
I think the other comment that's worth making there is it's not just a cost question, it is that there is going to be demand for services that are unfulfilled unless we use other techniques.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The service demands are going up almost exponentially.
Who's next?
Well, I'm going to put forth my question to all the panelists. I mean, I'm referring to the Kodia talk. I mean, does the DTV introduction mean the end to cognitive radio in the UHF and VHF bands? Yes.
There you go. I think it would be. Sorry. I think it's going to be very difficult. Certainly in urban areas, the spectrum use by the broadcast digital terrestrial television will be very high. There'll be very few unused channels. At each end of the band, where we're concerned about neighbouring services, there's mobile communication in the spectrum below the broadcast band, and in the spectrum above, where the digital dividend is, we expect it's very likely that IMT will go in there, cellular. And as Mansour says, cellular will be quite sensitive to the very high power broadcasts nearby. So I think every effort will be made in the channel plan to keep the spectrum use to a minimum in the end channels. So there's a possibility of some spectrum there. However, it might be that things like wireless microphones might need to find a parking space there as well. So you may need to still coordinate with them. So there's some chance of spectrum. I painted the blackest of pictures. Further out from the main centres, I think there'll be more unused channels, so there's a prospect there. But there is this interleaving, because what is a vacant channel in a more rural area will be used heavily in an urban area, so you may well be experiencing interference from the broadcast service. I mean, you've all talked about protecting the primary user, but the secondary user also needs to be protected. There we are.
Any other comments?
Thank you, Ian. You said yourself you painted the blackest of pictures. Fidel, the answer is slightly more complicated. The digital television effectively is taking the TV planning on the drawing board. So things like how many standard definition programs are needed, how many high definition programs are needed, what are the spectral efficiencies of techniques which are available today, could you have a single frequency network, or do you need to have this N plus X frequency plan, what are the transmit powers, what is the terrain involved. In Wellington the terrain is not as friendly for TV reticulation as in Christchurch is. So there are all these factors which need to be considered before an answer to you could be given, whether there will be white spaces or not. I hope I have given you some clues as to what are the various factors, and they have to be considered.